And one of the problems with the internet is that we've sold so much of our attention. It was Matthew Crawford who first brought me to the idea of the attention economy, and the idea that our attention is really, really precious and it's highly monetized online. And Nicholas Carr said that if you're not paying for the product online, you are the product. Your data is being sold to other companies in order essentially to make them able to advertise to you in a more sophisticated fashion. But we get real deep meaning from things that we give real deep attention to. And increasingly I've come to see the link between attention and loving. And I think it's really, really important that we realize that.
Welcome to Into the Truth, the podcast from the Catholic Truth Society. My name is Piero Finaldi, the CEO and publisher of the Catholic Truth Society, and I have the great honour and pleasure to welcome Father Toby Lees today to the podcast. Welcome, Father Toby.
Thank you very much. It's
becoming a bit of a kind of Dominican sort of CTS stroke Dominican podcast here. We've had a number of your confreres on, and it's always a great pleasure to speak. So Father Toby Lees is a Dominican priest. He's the assistant parish priest at the Our Lady of the Rosary and St Dominic's in London, and is also the priest director of Radio Maria England. So we can talk a bit about the use of the media, especially. But we're going to speak in particular about social media, how it affects your soul, and in particular about the sin of acedia.
Yeah.
I think that's how you pronounce it.
We'll go with that.
We'll
try and stick with that.
Okay, yeah, we'll try.
Nobody's agreed.
Yeah. We'll talk about the kind of issues around that. But just to get to know you a bit better, Father Toby, tell us a bit about how you ended up in a wonderful medieval habit.
Well, I still occasionally look down at myself and think, oh my goodness, what happened? I grew up in southeast London. Originally Nunhead, then East Dulwich.
Oh, I'm from Catford.
Exactly. Well, so Catford, the Black Cat on the shopping centre, feature of my childhood. Bromley Croydon.
Yeah.
My mum went shopping, and my mother was Catholic and had gone to a Catholic school near the Elephant and Castle. My dad was Australian, sort of agnostic. Went to an Anglican prep school, and then, really importantly for me, I went to Stonyhurst College, and I'd always believed. I think I had my first really genuine moment of prayer when I was about 8 or 9 and my hamster went missing. And I remember sitting there saying, God, if you make Holly come back, I'll be good. And I don't think I'd ever prayed with that degree of sincerity before. So when I look back, I think, yeah, I did really believe. And then a big turning point for me was just before GCSEs. And a friend of mine said, Toby, we're absolutely screwed. We haven't done enough revision. We need to go to daily mass. And I'd liked going to Sunday mass at school. It was great, 450 boys booming out hymns. It never occurred to me to go to daily mass. But the boy who I really liked, John Selden, Anglican, surprisingly, suggesting we go to daily mass. And I went and I liked it. And then after GCSEs, they'd gone really well, came back to school for lower sixth. And I thought, well, thanks God, exams went well, don't need that anymore. And to my surprise, I missed it. And so that started a habit of going to mass most days, something which then took a pause during university, but endured when I started work as a lawyer. And sort of cut a long story short, I found myself, I think, getting a little bit restless in the law. First of all, I'd absolutely loved it and was really ambitious. And then a friend of mine, Shola, suggested that I go to World Youth Day in Australia. I said, I don't really want to go because it sounds a lot like Catholic line dancing. And she was very persuasive, and I went, and there was a lot of Catholic line dancing, but it was actually quite good fun. And the talks by Pope Benedict were amazing, absolutely amazing. And when I came back, I just, without having made a decision, I knew I wasn't going to be a lawyer anymore. And that started a period of questioning, well, what will I do ended up studying part-time at Mary Vale in philosophy in the Catholic tradition. Met a Dominican sister who I like to tease her, and I say, Sister Yacinthe, in spite of being French, was very dynamic, joyful, intelligent, and inspiring. And I came across the order, and then it became a sort of an irresistible draw, really. Want to get married, had a lovely girlfriend, but just found myself being drawn towards religious life in the Dominicans.
So we both hail from the sort of small area of South London. Started off in the law as well. I started off studying law as well, but as well sort of other things that seemed far more interesting. And but tell me, so what did you then sort of specialise in as you in terms of studies as you prepared for the priesthood? And
Yeah, well, first of all, it's all very sort of like general. Everybody has to do the same thing, but I came across a book in St Paul's bookshop, and it was called The Two Faces of Laziness. And I found it intriguing. I had a little read, and it sounded like the woman had been reading my diaries if I had been writing them, because it really, really resonated with me. And it was about this vice or spiritual affliction, Acedia. And that started an interest. And then when it came to doing my license after priesthood, I was doing moral theology, and then when the choice of a topic for my license to see in a long form essay came up, I wanted to do something on Acedia, contemporary culture, and the potential links of Acedia to some forms of depression as we now know it.
So yeah, tell us a little bit more about this, because everyone knows that the seven deadly sins kind of stop, pride, lust, and then it all gets a bit hazy, and gluttony, and then it all gets a bit hazy after that. What is, first of all, where does this word acedia come from? What's it kind of related to?
So the word comes from Greek, and that's where the origins of the word are. And it's a lack of concern or a listlessness, which manifests itself primarily in a failure to bury the dead. And when we think about it, that might not sound that serious in one ways, but burying the dead is one of the ways in which we're distinguished from other creatures on Earth. You get elephant graveyards, but nobody's actually burying the dead. And so there is a dehumanizing element to Acedia. It's got a bit of a branding issue, because as we said at the top of the program, Acedia, Acedia, nobody's completely convinced on how to pronounce it. And it gets incorporated into the Christian tradition with a desert father called Evagrius of Pontus. And he, like the other monks who go out into the desert, they go out there very intentionally to confront the devil, to take on the demons. They go there because they think life has become too easy in the city. So they're not fleeing from the world as such. They're going for an intentionally more difficult form of life. And acedia is one of what Evagrius calls the 8 logismoi. And that can be translated as like deadly thoughts, or in fact demons. And he says that this is the last of the 8 deadly demons, deadly thoughts, and this is where the list of the 7 deadly sins derives from, with a few changes in the tradition. He says this is the last one that you have to confront, and after this comes peace. And if I can just read you a description of how he describes it, because I think it resonates with perhaps our experience of being at work and finding a project a little bit hard to get on with, or a student writing an essay constantly searching for diversion. And here he also gives its alternative name, the noonday demon. And he writes, "The demon of Acedia, also called the noonday demon, is the most oppressive of all the demons. He attacks the monk about the 4th hour and besieges his soul until the 8th hour. First of all, he makes it appear that the sun moves slowly or not at all, and that the day seems to be 50 hours long. Then he compels the monk to look constantly towards the windows, to jump out of the cell, to watch the sun, to see how far it is from the 9th hour, to look this way, and that lest one of the brothers might have the good idea of coming to distract him from the monotony of his cell. And then he goes on, he speaks about, and should there be someone during those days who offended this monk, this too the demon uses to add further to his dislike of the place. And what we see is this interior restlessness. The monk is supposed to be in his cell now praying, but his mind is everywhere else but where he's supposed to be, thinking, why did I leave the city? It was more fun in the city. I wonder what the other monk's up to. Is it something more fun? And I found as I just read that description that it resonated with me sometimes in my desire to give myself fully to the task that I was supposed to be doing, but this interior restlessness that I experienced.
And was that something that you had kind of experienced as a problem kind of before you kind of started studying it, or was it something that you kind of recognized sort of retroactively?
Yeah, I recognized it retroactively, and I think this is why it's really important that more people know about it, because once you give a name to it, so many people, when I've spoken about this to them, they're like, oh my goodness, I get that too. I experience that, but because they haven't been able to give it a name, they haven't been able to conceptualize what all these different systems point to. And Evagris says, there's an interior instability. He also says there's an aversion to manual labor, an excessive concern with health. And that's one which, when I first started thinking about this, I wasn't really on my mind. But I was thinking now of like Steve Bartlett. I don't know if you've come across his podcast, and increasingly now he's moved on from being about business advice and being a CEO,
yeah.
and basically he's got health experts on. You've got this ridiculous level of concern with what we eat. And
this kind
and our health.
Obsession of these kind of fad diets and things.
These fad diets and almost the idea that if I ate right, I wouldn't die.
Yeah.
And that's another symptom of Acedia, an inability to confront death. And so as I read this book, I started to think, I suffer from some of this. And then I started to read and see how this had come through the tradition, and people had done different thinking on it. There was a monk, John Cassian, who brought it to the West. He called it one of the 8 capital vices, by which he meant not so much a demon, but these tendencies which then lead towards other sins. And then St. Gregory the Great, who liked lists of 7, which have always been popular in the church because 7's a perfect number. And he took pride out of the list of 8 and made it the root of all sin. And then he added envy into the list, and then he merges acedia into sadness, because he thought that acedia was a particularly monastic problem and not something that the general public needed to be concerned with. And I think that was unfortunate, because it took it out of the tradition in some way. But nonetheless, Aquinas writes on it at some length, and I think is really insightful on it.
Yeah, because the lists, these sort of lists, like the list of the 7 deadly sins, etc., they're not always 100% kind of consistent through history and stuff. So that might be why people are sort of saying, "Oh, how come I'd never heard of this word before?" And I mean, I think it'd be worth saying, just trying to describe it a little more, because there's a kind of there's a strange sort of dichotomy at the centre of the Acedia, which on the one hand it's a kind of laziness, not wanting to do anything. On the other hand, it's this kind of crazy distraction, doing everything but what you're supposed to be doing. I mean, is that kind of central to the sort of definition, or there's all kinds of different things which come under that umbrella?
Everybody who writes about it at length identifies various different symptoms, sometimes which paradoxically include a restlessness and an element of laziness. I think when you speak about this interior instability and the difficulty of, say, somebody overcoming their inertia, and one of the reasons they might be unable to overcome their inertia and actually move to activity and doing something is because there's so many things that they might possibly do. And so they're lying there, particularly on their phone, with this whole world of different things that they might do. And because there's so many opportunities, and because choosing to do one thing entails giving up all these other possibilities, they end up doing nothing. Like, I hear it's a phenomenon of people actually spending an awful lot of time contemplating what they might watch on Netflix,
right?
And then never actually watching a program.
There's nothing on. It's like only a million things to choose from. You end up not watching anything.
Yeah. And it's curious, and people struggle to get, well, what actually causes it. Aquinas describes it as sorrow over our spiritual good, which is a strange thing, because why would we experience sorrow over that which is good for us? And when you look at Aquinas, his moral theology is closely tied to his psychology, and it's fascinating and really, really insightful and helpful. But he has this basic dynamic whereby, we're moved to do things by love. You know how your mother says to you, particularly, maybe in an Italian context, you shouldn't say you love pizza, you only like it.
Yeah.
Well, Aquinas thinks actually we're motivated to do everything by love. The highest love is caritas, that Christian charity, which is friendship with God. But there's amor, which I see the steak, and I don't have to contemplate whether I want to eat it or not. It's a steak, I recognize it as good. I love it. Because I love it, I desire it. And then when I'm united with it, I experience pleasure or joy. And I think part of the problem with it, Acedia, is that the things that cause us greatest joy, we've experienced the work entailed in union with them, in getting that thing, as onerous and too hard work. And this is where we get particularly into the contemporary situation, where you think the three basic types of adverts that you see, one promises you to make you more sexy. Use this perfume and you'll be in the desert in this devastatingly sort of dashing outfit, and you'll be irresistible to others. But the basic two others are, this will make your life more comfortable, or this will make your life more convenient. But as we know, the things that really, really give deep meaning and value to life, they're not comfortable or convenient. They're relationships. And so there's a lady called Rebecca Condyke de Jong, who I think is a Calvinist, but she's written as well as anyone on Aquinas on the vices and Acedia in particular. And she tries to examine, well, what is at the root of this Acedia? What can we give it? How can we unpack this definition of sorrow over our spiritual good, or disgust with activity? And she calls it resistance to the demands of loving. And I think that really gets to it, that loving is hard, but in a society, especially where we're told that things should be easy, things should be made easier for you, that we increasingly pick the easy option, and then we find that it doesn't satisfy, and there's this restlessness, or we search ever more for happiness in this thing which won't give it. And there's a difference between pleasure and joy, and I don't think our society gets that. It thinks if I had pleasure all the time, I would experience joy, whereas joy is pleasurable, but is not necessarily brought about by a succession of pleasurable experiences.
Right. So let me see if I've understood this correctly, because it's sadness about spiritual good. So we know that there's something which we want, which we know is good for us, which is something that we should be aiming for. But the fact that that spiritual good is difficult to attain means that we don't feel like we can be bothered to put the effort in, and so that good becomes kind of impossible to attain, and so we almost get into a kind of vicious circle where we just become sadder and sadder because we know that the good things are out of our reach, but it's kind of our own fault. Is that right?
No, that's a great summary. You should sit this side and do it with this podcast being much quicker. Aquinas identifies it the spiritual good that Acedia specifically relates to as being caritas, which is the highest good. As St. Paul says, it's friendship with God, the love of God, which transforms all our other loves. And so it's a relational good. If we think about, in order to have a relationship, I have to make sacrifices. The most fundamental sacrifice that exists in a relationship is the choice to be with this person as opposed to somebody else or some other activity. And if we reflect on our own experience, all relationships begin normally with fairly awkward small talk. And we have to get over that in order to get into the good stuff, which is why, let's be honest, we use the social lubricant of sort of alcohol, which helps us get through the small talk a little bit quicker, or we meet up under some other pretext of coffee or some other activity, because we're just all a bit awkward to start off with. And that intrigues me now that you see another thing Steve Bartlett does is conversation cards, where people get taught how to have a conversation with people. And you think, well, because we've found relationships difficult, we retreat into easier pleasures. Then we actually find ourselves fundamentally not only finding relationships difficult, but we don't even know how to have a conversation anymore. So to have any relationship, there is hard work and sacrifice involved. And obviously to have a relationship with Jesus Christ, which is our highest good, well, he calls us to imitate us. And St. Paul says that, as Christians, it's in him we live and move and have our being, that we're called to be like him, and that involves the cross. And he doesn't promise infinite pleasure. He promises eternal joy,
Didn't
but
say
it involves the cross.
take up your duvet and follow me.
No, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, presumably, what was the sort of date when you started kind of studying this in earnest?
I think I first started reading about it before I entered the order, so this would have been about 2010, I imagine, and then I started studying it in earnest in about 2017, when I had to do a long essay at the end of my STB, the initial theology degree that you do. And I wanted to look, I'd been reading some books by David Foster Wallace and Jonathan Franzen. And as I read them, I thought, they're describing Acedia. They're not able to give a name to it, but this is what they're describing.
I mean, the reason I ask that is because, if we take kind of 2015 maybe as the beginning of the social media kind of revolution at a kind of macro scale. I mean, in one sense, the noonday devil, if we describe it like that, if the noonday devil that sorry, what was the name of the church father?
Evagrius.
Yeah, the Evagrius kind of speaks about, if he had at his disposal social media, I mean, surely that is kind of Acedia kind of on steroids in a sense, which kind of takes us to the second part of what I wanted to speak about.
Absolutely, because there is everything that you might possibly conceive of looking at is available for most people in their pockets. And this is one of the interesting daughters that Cassian describes for the first time. Evagrius doesn't have it, I believe, but Cassian speaks about one of the symptoms can be curiosity.
Right.
And curiosity for Aquinas is the vice which is the opposite of studiositas, which is in essence being able to focus on the best and highest things. And instead we find ourselves clicking hyperlinks. They're devastating to concentration, and that's even fairly
scrolling through
early on, but you could be reading something on the internet and you don't know what that word is, and then you go down a whole wormhole, which is not bad stuff, but it's just not what you'd intended to be doing.
Not always bad stuff, but often.
That can happen, that it can actually be either seriously trivial stuff or get people into dangerous territory.
Yeah, so I think we're going to do that annoying thing, which is start criticising social media and jumping around on YouTube while we're speaking about on social media and YouTube, which kind of tends to happen. But this is like the good side of social media, so we'll just put that there. But it seems to me that almost like everything that you've been speaking about kind of gets concentrated and brought to like the highest possible level in these ridiculous things that we end up having on our phones, where you just get caught in this kind of endless cycle of doom scrolling, or just jumping from one idiotic video to another to another to another, and before you know it, the 2 hours have just sort of disappeared. And you've got nothing from it. In fact, and then it's probably shown you some pretty bad stuff: violence, sex, porn. Is I think at one point they were saying like 90% of the internet is basically porn.
Yeah, there was this song in the musical Avenue Q, which like said the internet is for porn.
Yeah,
it's horrendous, and you look at where the money is. So Nicholas Carr, who was writing about the internet and the problems of it, I think he was a little bit ahead of the curve on this, and this was before social media. He wrote a book called The Shallows, which followed a long-form essay that he had in the Atlantic magazine called Is Google Making Us Stupid? And one of the things that he points out in this book, he says that behind the internet is a philosophy of distraction. The internet is monetized not by you giving sustained attention to one thing for a long period of time, but rather by you looking at lots of different things, and then hopefully experiencing this dissatisfaction, this discontent, this sense of, when you spent ages browsing and you've got nothing to show for it, I want to have some high, I want to have something to show for it, which is why I think so many people end up, going onto porn online, because, then at least they get some high out of the end of browsing, but it just turns into this terrible spiral. But that is where the money is. It's behind the distraction, in the hope that you will buy something eventually, either because you're not thinking very hard, or because you've actually become a little bit depressed and you want a little high. And Aquinas says that we can't live for very long without pleasure, and that's why it's really, really important that we be intentional about where we seek our pleasure. And one of the problems with the internet is that we've sold so much of our attention. It was Matthew Crawford who first brought me to the idea of the attention economy, and the idea that our attention is really, really precious and it's highly monetized online. And Nicholas Carr said that if you're not paying for the product online, you are the product. Your data is being sold to other companies in order essentially to make them able to advertise to you in a more sophisticated fashion. And so you should buy more things. After listening to this podcast, you should order a book from CTS and actually give it sustained attention and read it, and then you can listen to Radio Maria whilst you're waiting for it to arrive. But we get real deep meaning from things that we give real deep attention to. And increasingly I've come to see the link between attention and loving. And I think it's really, really important that we realize that.
Yeah, and I mean, I noticed this in my own family, how the attention that we give to each other, whether it's in a couple or whether it's with our own children, or I'm sure it's even the same in a religious community, that the phone, the doom scrolling, the messages, the notifications, all the rest of it, what they tend to do there is to kind of take away from the real relationships. And it's another thing that I've found, a bit of a confession here, is that often I notice that there's a kind of very strong reaction when, for example, my wife tells me to get off my phone. Oh, you spent too long on it, and I react almost kind of in an unreasonably kind of defensive way. I was just wondering whether that's something that you've kind of come across or
Not from my wife.
okay, no, obviously, but,
No, because you're getting pleasure.
yeah.
There's a reason you're on your phone. It's because incredibly sophisticated psychologists have weaponized the most sophisticated technology to make the experience of being on your phone hugely pleasurable by the fact that you get massive dopamine hits. And the unpredictability of it, the fact that not everything that you watch is rewarding, this is a sophisticated part of it. If every time we got the reward on the video that we wanted, in fact, we'd go back less. There's unpredictability.
Right, so you have to go through a load of dross to basically find that little jewel.
It keeps us there longer because we're searching. We've got the idea of being on a search for something. Maybe that sort of goes back to hunter-gatherer instinct. I'm not sure, but bright colours, the fact that there are feedback loops. We write something and we're waiting to see, well, I engaged angrily with this person. Are they going to respond to me and admit that they're wrong, or will we enter into the duel? That you are getting dopamine hits that you're unaware of, and your wife is now saying to you, perhaps to do some prosaic task or just to have a conversation which doesn't give dopamine hits. I want you to give up pleasure. But as I said before, we mistake joy and pleasure. One Dominican friar once said you can go on the average high street at night in England and you'll find a whole lot of pleasure but not a lot of joy. And so we have to be intentional about seeking joy and seeking the places of real deep meaning.
I mean, it's an interesting thing I came across, and every year, the Oxford Dictionary comes up with a word of the year, and this year is come up. It's decided that the word brain rot is going to be the word of the year, and it defines it as the supposed deterioration of a person's mental or intellectual state, especially viewed as the result of overconsumption of material. Now, particularly online content considered to be trivial or unchallenging. And I'm kind of interested I mean, it's having an effect on us, like on what we are as people, or would you just say, this is just like another kind of iteration of, the monk looking out of the window or something, or is it something different, or is it a difference of degree or a difference of kind?
Well, I think we're aware now of neurobiology in a way that we weren't before, and the fact that actually there is neuroplasticity, and so your brain gets formed. There are some people who now argue that addiction is just the physiological response that we would expect to continually seeking pleasure in one particular good, and then the brain starts to wire that way as order towards seeking that good, and that's why we then find it so hard to quit our addictions, because we've actually become physiologically disposed towards them. And dopamine rewires the brain, and there's cells that fire together grow together, and so your brain is being changed by the way that you behave. St. John Paul II, without bringing the sort of neuroplasticity into it, because I don't think we were conscious at the time that he was writing with his sort of personalist philosophy, but he speaks about we as human beings can be uniquely conscious of the fact that we are sculpting ourselves. So we're both conscious of what we're doing in the moment, but we're also conscious of the fact that it is us who's doing it in this moment. And we have to realize that we're hugely consequential, and everything that we do now shapes who will be in the future. And the problem with so much of what we do online and with technology is both that we're not thinking and also that we don't know what it's doing to us. And that's why it's particularly vicious to give social media to children when they're at an age where their brains haven't even fully formed, and they don't have the defenses that an adult might have, the neuro resilience to the sorts of reward patterns that they're going to very easily slip into. And I think that's a part of the reason why you see a teenage mental health crisis.
Yeah, and that it's had huge impact in all sorts of ways, and one of the very clear correlations has been with the kind of rise of trans ideology and all that, fed very much by the internet.
Yeah, and if you think about it, this is where we're not, as a society, we're not flourishing. We are in the most materially rich society ever in human history. We have better medicines than any society has ever had, and yet we seem unhappy. And even David Foster Wallace, who I mentioned before, in his book Infinite Jest, he says that he wants to deal with the fact that there seems to be something particularly sad about his generation, and he wants to investigate why that is. And it's because we are creatures, and we are creatures made for a certain end. And that end is our union with God and our experience of loving human friendships. And when that's frustrated, it seems natural to me that depression and unhappiness would start to occur. And in the same way, when you used to go to zoos in the late 80s and early 90s, and people were just starting to get aware, like, why is the lion in the cage, like, walking up and down, and he's rubbing himself against the bars, and he's literally, like, wearing his fur off? And people go, well, he's depressed because he can't hunt. The lion had all the food that he might need. He's never going to starve in the zoo in the way that he might in the wild. But because it's not the lion, part of being the lion is not just to eat, but it's also to hunt. And we live in a society which says to us, you do you, that we can choose how we want to be happy. Well, we can make the choice of what we think might make us happy, but the reality is that we are creatures with a nature, and if we don't flourish, then we will be sad. And so, let's be completely honest, transgenderism is largely now occurring in girls near the time of puberty. It used to be a middle-aged man phenomenon. Now it's 75% of cases, I think, are girls before the time of puberty or around puberty. That's a really tough time. It's difficult.
But I think this question of also our end, what it is that we're made for, the kind of givenness of our nature and what we should tend towards, is always going to kind of bubble up and force us to ask ourselves what we're doing, unless we're distracted. Reality will not, will fail to impose itself if we're constantly distracted. And it just seems to me that everything that kind of happens at the moment in the kind of general culture is just one huge distraction after another to stop us from thinking about what we're for, where we're going, that we're going to die, and what's going to happen after we die. And it just don't think about that. Don't think about that. Watch this cat video, or watch this porn clip or whatever, and don't think about it.
But if we were sitting here and we weren't Catholic, and our worldview was everything I love is going to end up in annihilation, and nothing that I love actually has any meaning anyway.
Well, that just about sums it up for me. No, quoting from Groundhog Day.
Yeah, you're going to seek distraction because that's profoundly depressing. And that's why we get back to, fascinatingly, one of the concerns about Acedia with health and an inability to look death head on. And I think that was one of the things that was so interesting about the pandemic, that people became petrified about dying, when dying is in the natural fallen order of things. And I think people were, for the first time, confronted with the reality that they might actually die, and they didn't know how to deal with it. I wouldn't want to be a politician and decide how you're supposed to deal with it, but you could tell certain people who were suddenly saying, you cannot put a value on a life. Like, everybody should be locked up inside if it will save one life. Yeah. And they neglect the fact that the NHS, which they were applauding weekly, and that's great. I was working for it at the time. Thank you for the applause. But you neglect the fact that the NHS makes funding decisions every single day on what drugs will be available, on the cost value benefit of keeping somebody alive for another day. We're always saying, actually, this is an acceptable level of death, or it's worth paying for this, and it's not for that, because people will die no matter what we do. And if you can't live with that fact, well, then you can't live in reality. And so then you seek to escape from reality. And how do you do that? Well, in a world of infinite jest, to borrow the title of the David Foster Wallace book.
I mean, it was unfortunate, I think, during COVID, because I thought, gosh, this is our moment. You know, we're suddenly, everybody's thinking about serious things, and we've actually got something to say about that. And in many ways, I think the church kind of fluffed its lines, I think, I would say. So one of the favourite parts of Pope Francis' encyclical on Laudato Si is where he speaks about technology. And I think one of the most interesting things that he says there is that technology is not neutral. What he says kind of reminds me a bit about, you know, the line in The Lord of the Rings about the ring, that the ring wants to be found. You know, it's not just there; it has a kind of will of its own. And so I suppose it's especially a question that parents constantly, you know, I do a bit of speaking about, you know, bringing children up in the faith, and always the question, what about, you know, what can we do about social media? What can we do about phones? And then I'll often answer, it's like the problem is not even with our children. You know, first of all, it's with us. So in that sense, what would you suggest? You know, how can we find a healthy way of dealing with this technology, which is ubiquitous but not neutral?
Be aware of that fact that the Canadian philosopher of media, Marshall McLuhan, who was a Catholic convert and perhaps most famous for his phrase, "The medium is the message," he recognised that, you know, we invent new forms of media to respond to a particular need that we have. So, for example, television. You know, what's lacking in radio? What's lacking in radio is the fact that you can't see the people. But then television doesn't just become radio with visuals. In fact, the visual element starts to take over from the audio element. And so the new media actually starts to dictate the sort of content that is being produced through it. Now, a really easy example of seeing that in action is to look at X and to see that when you reduce discourse to a certain number of characters, then immediately you no longer have argumentation with any nuance. And when it's in a medium where things are monetized by the number of retweets and views and likes that you're getting, then there is an incentive to be sensational and controversial. And so to be successful on that particular medium, you cannot be reasonable in a certain sense. You cannot have nuance, and you cannot just make bland, ordinary statements. And so when people go, oh, well, it's all about how you use it or whether you use it right. No, it's not. It's not there.
Because it's baked into the way that it works.
Yeah.
That it drives you towards a certain kind of discourse.
And so it's why the conversation that we're having here should not be a reason to then go and watch 3 more videos. It should be an incentivization to get out of the swamp. You know, to come back in a week and watch another video which gives you real content, but not just watch a video after a video after a video, because you'll end up, you know, watching the sort of stuff that we've spoken about. Because, you know, much as I try to be engaging, this conversation is harder work than some of the other things that you might be watching. So I think we need to be present. You know, the church is called to be present everywhere where people are. And this is a big Pope Francis theme about accompanying the people. But we don't go into the swamp to say, oh, well, I'll sit with you whilst we slowly sink together. We go into the swamp in order to take people out of there into something better and more life-giving. And so to get to your question about what do we do with regards to the media and particularly in parenting, I think you have to be prepared to be unpopular, but you also have to do it with other parents. You can't make your child a social pariah where your kid is the only kid in school who's not on all the platforms that all his friends are on, because he just becomes isolated and he starts to resent you for that and hates you and doesn't trust you. You have to say to parents collectively, or hopefully, as you've seen in Australia with some action taken by the government, no, actually, like, an individual response to this isn't enough. We need to take collective action. And so if a whole group of people say, actually, we're not going to let our kids have phones until they're 16, then none of the kids feel left out.
Yeah, I can't say,
and in fact,
I'm the
they'll
only
flourish.
one.
No,
Yeah.
no. Oh, you're ruining my life. Like, I hate you. Like, I'm never going to have any friends because of you. Like,
showing our age, like, was it Kevin and Perry? Yeah, I mean, no, thanks for that. I think that's very useful. And I mean, going back to the kind of the beginning of our conversation about Acedia, because I think although in a sense the social media and technology are fantastic tools in the hands of the noonday devil, I think even if we were all to abandon it tomorrow, Acedia wouldn't go away.
no.
So what's the best way of fighting that?
I think we have to be really, really intentional about it, to recognize that we're in a fight. That's why I made that point about Evagrius and the other desert fathers and mothers going out into the desert intentionally. They realized that they were engaged in warfare against the evil thoughts, evil spirits. And when we recognize that we are actually engaged in a battle, it's not that we're just like scrolling and we're like, well, it doesn't really matter, or this is a little bit annoying that I'm not doing what I intended to do now. No, actually, when I don't do what I intended to do, when I don't do the more loving thing, then actually I'm saying yes to the demon of Acedia, and I'm sort of truncating, vitiating against my ability to love and to give real attention to things. And so to be really, really intentional about what you give your attention to recognize that that's precious. There's a story that I sometimes tell of when I was in Rome on the Chalian Park, which was just up from San Clemente where I lived. And there was an Italian who was stereotyping himself by being on the phone and gesticulating wildly with his hand whilst he was on the phone. And he had a tennis ball in his hand and his dog was with him. And the dog is going absolutely crazy.
Following the ball.
He thinks the ball is about to go. And I was sitting there for 5 minutes, both in hysterics. So the guy's completely oblivious to his dog because his attention is fully on his phone, not who he's with. And just wanted to say to the dog, like, just don't look at it. Just don't look at it. But the dog has no choice. But you can choose what you give your attention to. And there's a scene in the film Lady Bird, which I think is a beautiful and poignant film. She's rejected her baptismal name or given name of Christine, and she goes by the name of Lady Bird. And she's not Catholic, but she's in a Catholic school. And at one point she's written an essay about Sacramento, and the headmistress of the school calls her in to speak to her about the essay, and she says, "It seems to me that you really love Sacramento." And she's been moaning the whole film with her mother about she can't wait to leave Sacramento and go elsewhere to college. And she responds surprised, like, "I do?" And she goes, "Yes, with the way you write about it, with such care and detail." And then Lady Bird goes, "Well, I guess I just pay attention." And the sister says to her, "Loving and paying attention, don't you think they might be the same thing?" And Simone Weil, the great sort of philosopher and mystic, she described as attention as being the rarest and purest form of generosity. And so in giving your attention to someone, you are making it a gift of yourself. You're intentionally choosing to love them as opposed to something else. And we should be really, really intentional about what we love, because what we love shapes us and also determines whether we'll know joy or just a succession of pleasures which will make us depressed.
So when we talk about the noonday devil, for example, or the demon of Acedia, I just want to be kind of clear about what we mean by that, because I think often we can just sort of talk about it as a I don't know, a sort of generic thing. I mean, in the church, when we speak about the devil or a demon, we speak about an actual devil and an actual demon, and I think it kind of underlines the kind of seriousness of this problem. I mean, how would you kind of approach that, or how does Thomas Aquinas or even Evagrius?
Yep.
How does Evagrius deal with that?
Evagrius actually has a collection of sayings, as some of the other Desert Fathers do, of Scripture, taking the precedent from Christ in the temptations in the desert, where when the devil tries to tempt Christ, he responds to him quoting Scripture back at him in its proper context. And so Evagrius, and you can still buy the book by him. We have the collection of little lines from Scripture that he would use when fighting particular temptations or experiencing particular sorrows. And so it goes back, as I said several times, about being really, really intentional, recognizing that there is a battle going on right now, that I am weak and frail, and that I need to bring the Lord into this. But if we don't recognize that there's a battle, then there's just a certain drift that goes along, and we won't win because we're not fighting.
And to recognize that we have an enemy, because I think the whole kind of the martial language that the church used in the past, spiritual warfare, the weapons of prayer, and all these things, slightly became went out of fashion a bit, and we lost the feeling that we're in a battle, or the sense that we're in a battle, but we are.
Yeah, we abandoned our psychological tradition, and we completely replaced it with contemporary psychology, which has some very real and useful insights. But what the church is always able to do when she's at her best is to incorporate the best of what she finds outside of herself and bring it into a coherent system. And that's why Aquinas is so useful as a thinker to study in the totality of his thought, because he's thought about pretty much everything. And then he gives you a coherent world view and crucially a coherent anthropology of the human person, as well as this sense that there is a warfare going on between the angels and the demons. And so we can make sense of the insights of contemporary psychology, and we can also draw upon our incredibly rich tradition. And I'd advise anybody to read the Desert Fathers and Mothers, because you will relate to their experiences, because human nature doesn't change. The circumstances in which we find ourselves, and one thing being a bigger temptation now and another thing at another point, that changes. But fundamentally, we struggle with the same things, and they have really deep insights on how to deal with these things, and crucially, they give them a name.
And they had no doubt that they were going into the desert to fight. No?
Fully intentional.
Yeah.
The war is going on. The only question is whether you decide to recognise that you're in a war or not.
Well, thank you so much, Father Toby. I think that was extremely useful and very practical, as well as being extremely kind of inspiring and quite deep. So I was really, really happy that we've had this conversation. So where can people find your work, or you work a lot with Radio Maria?
Yep, so mainly there. So you can listen to Radio Maria on digital radio if you're in London, Cambridge, South Birmingham, Bristol, South Manchester, Stockport, and Liverpool. But anywhere with the Radio Maria Play app, or ask your smart speaker to play Radio Maria England, and then we're on Spotify and other podcast providers, which you should like and subscribe to it, and then you should do the same to CTS whilst you're there, because we're both trying to transform the culture, aren't we? We're trying to point people to more transcendent things which will nourish and give life.